pariah country, pariah nation, that there's this opportunity there. I don't know if that resonates with Putin. I'm absolutely sure it does not resonate with Putin the same way that something like that would resonate with President Trump.
All right, we're nearing the bottom of the hour, and so the press was called in very quickly to the room there. As we were learning, it's now been confirmed the meeting's over, lasting nearly 3 hours. So now we wait for President Trump and Vladimir Putin to take the podium, address the press. You do see what looks and appears to be some from the Russian delegation in the front row there. I'm not entirely sure who they are, but you have more and more people entering the room. So, Hal Kempfer on with me. What is this going to be like? What are they going to say off the top? How much are we going to get a picture inside the conversation, Hal?
Well, my sense is, because this is in the U.S., more likely than not, President Trump will kick it off. And he just kind of does that naturally. That's just what he does. And I have a sense that President Trump, he'll speak to the press corps. He'll have his comments, and then at some point they'll turn it over to Putin to say his comments. My guess, I could be wrong, but my guess will be that Putin will use a translator. He'll probably speak in Russian, and he'll have a translator there. And that's a wise thing to do. If you're a world leader, you want to be careful. And we've all heard world leaders that say something when they're trying to speak English, and they say something, maybe a colloquialism or something, and they get it wrong. And then that's the story of the next day. So he'll want to make sure he gets it right. So I imagine he'll be using a translator, and then he'll be using a translator for taking questions. And it's not that he doesn't understand what the reporters are saying. However, he is a human intelligence officer, all right? He is a counterintelligence officer. This is, manipulating people, getting them to do things that they don't want to do, whatever, recruiting people, getting them to betray their countries. That's what he did for a living. And he's actually very good at a lot of things. I mean, he went from that to, basically becoming the head of Russia. So he's got some tremendous skills in that regard. Well, using a translator allows you some time to think about how you want to formulate a response to a question. And then he can reply in Russia. And so you got a little bit of time lag going there. Gives him more time to think. He can say something in Russian, and then it has to get translated over in English to the reporters. All of that kind of delays some of that singe factor with some of the questions that could be asked. So that's what I'm kind of anticipating, is he's kind of sort of it's not a big orchestration. It's a very common tactic, but he'll be kind of orchestrating that to make sure that if there is a really tough question asked, that he will have some way of delaying that getting to him, and then coming back in such a way that a lot of the edge, if you will be taken off of it.
So, Hal, I have to ask this. Who's a better read of people? Trump or Putin? You mentioned Putin's background as a KGB officer. Trump touts that he's a good read on people he comes into contact with. Condoleezza Rice was saying a couple of days ago, Putin has more to lose here, that Putin is more reliant on Trump in this situation rather than the other way around, Trump vis-a-vis Putin. Do you agree with that assessment?
It's interesting. President Trump, different background, and frankly, we saw him reading people for years on television. Yeah. And so he's got some pretty good skills in terms of reading people. But Putin, everyone who's dealt with Putin, certainly anybody from the intelligence world that's had any dealings with Putin, say that he is always working the room. He is always gauging people. He is always, manipulating, if you will, but he is constantly assessing, figuring out what he wants to do. And they say to watch him work a room is to watch somebody who, very calm external demeanor, but you can tell their brain is just whirring 1,000 miles an hour to figure out how he can get exactly what he wants. And that's some of his tradecraft, if you will, in avoiding saying something that would offend somebody or would cause problems, but at the same time to avoid committing to something that he doesn't want to commit.
Yep.
And I'm going to be listening to that very closely with his responses to see exactly what type of language he uses, and if he's using some of that delaying tactic stuff as opposed to addressing, the main issues at hand.
Yeah, I would imagine there's going to be some type of interplay between the two on the stage there. The psychology of all of this is quite fascinating. How back to the war, though? You have told me time and time again, Putin has no interest in ending this war. Will Trump have to convince him to end the war, that it's in Putin's interest to end the war? Do you think he'll try to do that?
The only way you can really do that is, and I do believe the threat of secondary sanctions does weigh heavily on him. His economy is not doing well. His economy is transitioned over to a war economy. He's basically drawn down on their sovereign wealth fund in order to pay for that. The other part of it's being paid for with oil and gas revenues. That's oil exports that goes to countries like India and China. Now, you've seen what President Trump, what the U.S. has done with tariffs on India. A lot of that is aimed at telling India, hey, quit funding the war, Russia's war against Ukraine. We haven't done quite the same. I mean, we have pretty substantial tariffs, I should say, with China. But part of that is due to the fact that we're in the middle of some very significant trade negotiations with China. So I don't think they wanted to throw a proverbial wrench into those negotiations at this point.
So Hal,
but those tariffs are significant.
So Hal, I'm sorry to be pessimistic on this question on sanctions and crippling the Russian economy. We would have seen that over the last 3.5 years. I mean, they have weathered that in some respect.
They've weathered. I got to say this: they have adapted very quickly to a lot of different sanctions.
Okay.
And I'm not saying they wouldn't try to adapt to these sanctions as well. In fact, what I would assume is if we were to put these draconian sanctions in place on China and India, that they would find some creative way to circumvent that, to have oil get essentially laundered, if you will, around the world so it could get to them. It would be very difficult to do in the short term. In the long term, I think they could do some, but it would be a lot tougher than getting the oil direct. And in the meantime, Russia would be experiencing a significant loss of revenue that could go into the war effort. So what that, long story short, if we were to impose those sanctions, say today, it would be a very tough fall for Russia from a lot of different ways. The other thing too, which is kind of hanging out there and has been addressed this week several times, is the prospect of liquidating those frozen Russian assets. That's $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. $230 billion of that is actually held by European countries. They could liquidate that without the U.S. if they wanted to. The U.S. holds about $26 billion. You may recall that there was a co-sponsor bill with Senator Murkowski from Alaska, where she actually had built into an $54 billion aid program or bill for Ukraine, that 26 of that was going to come from liquidating the assets, those Russian assets the U.S. holds. So that's another thing that President Trump could talk about. If Ukraine was able to get, say, 80 billion or 100 billion or something a year from those frozen assets, then Putin would be looking at diminished oil revenue, a sovereign wealth fund disappearing, and Ukraine having a lot of money to buy arms, ammunition, everything. Those things put together, that could have a substantial impact on Putin and what his thinking is.
All right. Meredith McGraw at the Wall Street Journal has some reporting of who's in the room, saying the press was quickly moved into the auditorium. Some of President Trump's senior aides are seated for the press conference, including Stephen Chung, Natalie Harp, Dick Luna, Margot Martin, Will Sharp, and James Blair. On the Russian side, she sees Kirill Dmitriev. Hal, what do we know about him? He's been somewhat front and center during some of these talks over the last 6 months. Dmitriev, what's his role in all of this?
Well, he's been, yeah, as you said, he's been front and center with the talks. He's been in the middle of this whole thing all the way around. That he's sitting there waiting for the press conference tells me, and I'm not, it was 3-on-3. I don't know if there was 3 in the room itself. I don't know if they had anybody at the back seats, shall we say. He would be someone I would expect to have in the back seats, or somebody would be standing by if there was a question that came up during the discussions. The fact that he's actually out there in the press conference room waiting for these remarks tells me whatever role he was playing in the background, he doesn't have to play anymore. That they have worked out whatever they're going to work out for this particular session, this particular meeting, this particular summit, and that his expertise is not needed for, or his role, interlocutor role, is not needed for anything else that's being done. So I find that kind of interesting that he's out there. The fact that he's out there standing by tells me they've kind of wrapped up whatever the meeting is here, and we're just literally waiting for President Trump and Putin to come out and say whatever it is they're going to say.
Al, I've asked you so many times, and for viewers who don't know, you have been with us since the very start of this war. You were on with us the night of the very invasion in February of 2022. I always ask you, when will Putin budge, and how will Putin budge? Up until now, he has expressed no desire to end this war, nor have the people around him. So what gives? What will be any, concession that he may make? The president was saying he would accept some form of a ceasefire after the talks are all said and done. What does that mean?
What's kind of interesting with Putin, if I could address that first part, is I honestly, and I remember vividly what happened in 1991. That was a big year for me. I mean, first off, we had a little thing called Desert Storm you may have heard of. I spent some time over there, came back, and I remember this rapid change of events. 89 through 91 was just an amazing, for a Cold Warrior, it was just an amazing shift in how fast countries and leaders disappeared on the scene. And he lived through that. He saw, that's why he's no longer a KGB officer per se, is because part of that was the KGB went away. And it became reformed with the FSB, but nonetheless, that was a rapid change. And of course, what he's probably more concerned about is whatever comes from this war is what happens on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. There is that saying, and I know I've said it before, that dictators, and I'm going to call Putin a dictator, dictators always look like they're never going to be displaced until the last 5 minutes. Then all of a sudden everything disappears. He knows that dynamic. He knows Russian history. He knows what's happened in Russian history, that if the system that props him up, that keeps his regime in power, falls, it will fall very quickly. So what that means, bring you back a little bit, is that President Trump has to say things, not directly saying you're going to be overthrown or something like that, but has to say things that Putin understands could create a situation where the Russian people have just had enough. And I think that's what would scare Putin. That would get Putin to budge, if you will, is if he was seriously concerned that the dynamics were in play that could threaten his survival, if you will, which could be physical survival too, but threaten his survival as being the head of state of Russia.
Do you think there's just like a human element to this? Putin is 72 years old. He knows he's not going to live forever. Maybe he doesn't know that. That, the long term of all of this, we always say Putin plays the long game, that at some certain point, it will have to end or morph into something else.
You think that. I don't know if, sometimes I wonder if some world leaders think that they're going to live forever. Yeah. And we've certainly seen a number of very famous world leaders literally die in office. They never think they're going to leave. He may think, at some point here I'm going to have to leave, but he looks around. He says, but that point is not today. It could be 3 years from now, 6 years from now, 9 years from now, whatever. So I don't think he's planning his immediately vacating that office by any stretch. I think he thinks he's going to be there for a while. I do think that he thinks he can right now he thinks that Russia can outlast the resolve of the West. And he has a view of the West that others have had too. Saddam Hussein had this view, others that, more famously, Osama bin Laden had this view that the United States or the West, that we are paper tigers. What they see, what these authoritarian regimes see, is the messy dynamic of democracy, which they hate, and they see that as weakness. And historically, they have always seen democracies as weak, that they go in there with determination, with control, and they break the democracies. And I just think that's a fallacy that they have. I think democracies are actually far more resilient than authoritarian countries. I think that give and take dynamic is what makes us, when we turn hard. And I've seen this, I certainly saw it on 9/11. I saw it with Desert Storm. There was a resolve that I'm sure Saddam Hussein never dreamed would ever happen. And when the U.S. makes a determination we're going to do something, we do something, yeah. And it usually catches these guys off guard.
Yeah, you had indicated to me earlier in the week that, and because some of the critics of this entire meeting have said it's a propaganda victory for Putin, but you acknowledged that was going to happen either way. Mm-hmm. Depending on how the meeting went. And we're getting some reporting on how the meeting went from the Russian side, according to Fox's Brett Baer, that it has gone somewhat well. I'm paraphrasing. And so we'll just have to wait and see officially in front of the cameras if that holds up here. But to that question that I just posed.
Rephrase that if you would. I would, because I was listening to the Brett Baer thing. I'm sorry.
Right. I was echoing some of the comments, some of the reporting from Brett Baer, signaling from the Russian side, his sources saying that the meeting has gone well. But I was asking about the propaganda victory that some of the critics of the very meeting itself have said Putin will get no matter what. You acknowledge that too, but you said that's beside the point at this point.
I think it really is beside the point. Look, if let's look at it this way. Where to hold the meeting.
Okay, Hal. Just to interrupt here. We just saw Steve Witkoff enter the room.
Oh wow. Okay.
So we just had U.S. Special Envoy Witkoff enter the room there. So things could be moving along quite rapidly. We'll get back to that question. It's an important question. Let's listen in actually to the sound in the room briefly. You see there some of the American reporters doing their stand-ups. You see there Caitlin Collins with CNN, Peter Alexander with NBC, and Hal Kemper still with me. So had to note that for the viewers, Hal. Steve Witkoff now in the room. You also see some of the Russian delegation in the front row on the left-hand side as well. But we wait for the principals, obviously, to get into the room. Haven't seen them yet. Once we do, everyone will be watching this press conference live in its entirety. We'll see how many questions each of these leaders takes. But Hal, Putin does have quite the coterie of Russian press traveling with him, does he not?
He does, and I fully expected something like that. And to go back to your previous question, this is a propaganda win. There's no two ways about it. Just to have this meeting is a propaganda win. My understanding, what kind of has been seeping out of Washington, D.C. on this is that President Trump did not really want to go back to the Middle East again. He'd had that really big trip back there, and so going to the UAE or Doha for something like this wasn't that great. And the problem that Putin had, of course, is that he's got a International Criminal Court warrant, so there's not that many places he can actually go. So they brought him over here. But to have him come to the U.S., which you get into the dynamics of where do you hold this thing, wherever he went, it was going to be some sort of propaganda victory. And I don't think you can have a meeting with President Trump and Putin without Putin considering his pariah status on the international stage, without that being some sort of propaganda victory for Russia. On the other hand, if they had not done all these things, like the red carpet, the driving together, all these things, that's to build rapport. That's to try and work through some of those issues. That's to build an assessment of where they were going to go with this. And obviously, President Trump was saying he'd know within the first couple of minutes if this was going to go bad. Well, by the time that first couple minutes was over, they were done with the ride in the car. So we would have known right away that that would have been an issue. So I think, yeah, propaganda thing. But the other thing is they're trying to get Putin to do something he doesn't want to do. I don't think he really wants to end the war right now. And they're trying to constellate everything to somehow build in his mind that, that this is the time. This is when you have to do something.
All right, we just have a different vantage point there, trying to recognize some of these White House staffers. Looks like Will Sharp there in the front row. So Hal, interesting to note, on the way to Anchorage, Trump was on the phone with the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko. Now, why would he have done that?
That actually caught me by surprise. I tell you, I'm trying to think the last president that talked to Lukashenko. It's just not somebody you talk to. Of course, he is kind of a proxy, if you will. He runs Belarus, but he's a dictator, and he basically is only in power because Russia backs him. And Russia's made it pretty clear that they're going to basically absorb Belarus at some point. So that's the bargain that's been made with that. But I think the reason he called him was he was trying to assess things, and he probably felt that Lukashenko may have a better feel for what's going on, because Lukashenko is actually one of the few world leaders that actually meets with Putin. I don't know about a regular basis, but they do meet more frequently than he meets with anybody else, And I got to tell you this, the other one he talked to would be, Xi in China. I think that would not work out too well. And then, of course, Kim Jong-un, I think that would be a complete waste of time to talk to Kim Jong-un about anything. But talking to Lukashenko, he might be able to give him some sort of assessment as to what was going on. And I think, President Trump likes to, as he said, this is a kind of an interesting term, a feel-out session. And so he was trying to feel out things before he actually landed in Alaska.
What about our European allies? There's some reporting out there to suggest President Trump may be on the phone with them and the Ukrainian side as we speak. We'll wait for more confirmation on that. I would imagine they're going to be watching this live, but they will be getting their own readouts.
I think they will. And actually, that is a very good sign. The fact that he's on the phone with our European allies. I would imagine the big three he's talking to, would obviously be, Starmer, Macron, over in Germany, and then, of course, President Zelensky. But there might be some sort of breakthrough here. There might be something substantial. We're going to know soon enough if there is. But the fact that he's on the phone with them, I'm going to stay hopeful, and I'm hoping he's sharing with them something that was very positive that came out of the meeting.
Now, if there is a breakthrough, the question is, will Ukraine accept that? All right, we do have the photographers getting ready. Okay, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, now in the room here.
Okay.
Okay, so he was obviously one of the three in the Russian delegation. So you see there more of the delegation coming into the front row here. Let's take this full head on. You see James Blair, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff. All right, so it does look like they are readying this press conference. You also see Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on hand, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, also Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and let's see here, trying to recognize Caroline Leavitt there, the White House Press Secretary. So all parties from the U.S. side, Hal, are now in the room, except, of course, the principal himself, President Trump. So we wait for Trump and Putin. It looks like this is happening imminently here. Hal Kemper, stay on the line. We're chatting with you on the very back end once the press conference wraps. We thank you so much. Andrew Kraft back here in the anchor chair as we are watching now for President Trump, for Vladimir Putin to begin their joint press conference in Anchorage, Alaska. So this is almost happening. The moment we've been waiting for, obviously the moment you see there. Okay, Secretary of State Rubio, Steve Witkoff, remember they were in the room with President Trump. It was 3-on-3. We know it lasted nearly 3 hours. And you see there Secretary of State Rubio kind of hamming it up for the cameras. And so now we wait for President Trump, Vladimir Putin. This is happening imminently at any moment. Let's listen in. Okay, so this is, like I said, it's happening at any moment, where we will let you watch uninterrupted the entire press conference there in Anchorage, Alaska. Remember, this all came together in a 1 week's time. We brought you the news 1 week ago today, last Friday, that this was happening now today, this Friday. So somewhat hastily arranged. But to Hal Kemper's point, is there a breakthrough? That is the question. What has been agreed upon, if anything? And if anything, will the Ukrainians agree to that? Remember, they're the other party in this war. Though they may not be there in person right now, they will be getting a readout. The fate of their country hangs in the balance as they continue to face Russian attacks and Russian aggression here. So those two words there, smack dab in the middle, pursuing peace, only two words, a simple statement. Not all that easy, as so many who have tried.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We had very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well, there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Now naturally under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And special envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see this drive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation. However strange it may sound in these conditions, we have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe, thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, wow. So this is what we just watched there, statements from Trump and Putin. Putin speaking first. No questions taken by reporters gathered there in the summit venue in Anchorage. So this was not expected in any joint press conference setting. You anticipate, you expect the principals, the leaders on hand will take questions from the press. They did not just do that here. President Trump saying that the meetings were productive, some things were agreed to, but not the thing that they came for. Putin saying that the conversations were productive here. So in the meantime, we do have to get into more of these conversations here because this is quite something. Let's go back out live to our vantage point there. And we have Hal Kempfer still standing by here. We're going to bring him into the conversation in just a moment. But in the meantime, like I said, this was not expected. This was very, very surprising. Hal Kempfer joining us right now again. Hal, your initial thoughts. I don't think anyone expected this. I'm still struck by the fact that it ended that abruptly. Remember, we were told this was going to be happening in about 30 minutes' time. It was moved up. You were speaking on the fact that presumably it was moved up because there was some progress. There was some good signs being made. What did you hear from Putin and Trump? And why did Putin get to speak first, Hal?
That actually surprised me, Andrew. I think the reason that Putin spoke first is because we heard a lot of flattering. We heard a lot of broad comments, talking about Lend-Lease in World War II, or the support for Russia with the U.S. and that we once were allies in the war, against the Axis powers. And what I heard was a lot of, well, I'm going to just say very flowery language coming out of Putin. And it kind of left me scratch my head, which is, why is he doing this? And as I kept listening to Putin, I wasn't hearing a lot of substance. I wasn't hearing, key points. I really didn't hear the outline of an agreement to speak of. And then he was done. And, President Trump said his stuff. And again, he said there was agreement on some parts. I am hoping that we're going to get some sort of communique or something that gives us a kind of clearer idea of what they actually agreed to, because frankly, from the speech, it wasn't clear to me at all. They said there was a reference to stopping thousands of people dying every week. Okay, does that mean that we have a ceasefire? And if it is a ceasefire or an offer for a ceasefire from Russia, what does that consist of? And it could be that Russia's saying, yeah, we'll have a ceasefire. Ukraine pulls back from, the 4 oblasts that are still being contested and gives us that terrain, and there'll be a ceasefire. That would be something that, I could see Putin putting out there, because he's already said that before, in which case there was nothing agreed to. So I don't know what it was. I was kind of left a little flat with that, and I was hoping that reporters' questions would really start to open the door, get into the details. And then I was like you. I was a little bit struck by the fact they didn't take any reporters' questions. We talked about the fact that Putin was going to have a tough time with Western reporters asking very frank, direct questions, because that's not what he's used to. And I'm assuming that they just came to some sort of mutual agreement that said we won't take any questions from reporters. Obviously, that makes Putin feel very good.
Do you think it was mutual? Or was that a Kremlin request?
I think it has to be mutual. Well, I don't know if Trump ever said that, but okay. But I could see Putin saying, look, I don't want to take these reporters' questions, and in order not to break the rapport, in order not to create a very tense, uncomfortable situation, they decided better not to take any questions at all than to take questions that would upset whatever positive energy is coming from this thing. Again, I listened to him. I cannot figure out what they actually agreed to, and frankly, he says, I'm going to get on the phone and call President Zelensky. Is there an offer for another meeting? I'm not even quite sure. Is there going to be another summit after this? I'm thinking there is.
Okay.
But again, it sounds like he kind of tossed that into President Zelensky's court as to where it is. I would really hate to see President Trump go to Moscow. He said he'd be in hot water. Oh, he'd be in a lot of hot water. I think he would have significant, huge international political repercussions, but I think the domestic political repercussions would be pretty significant as well.
Okay, so Hal, we're still looking at this live venue there, our shot. I want to put this up for viewers. Meg Kennard, our colleague and friend at the Associated Press, with the AP Dateline and filing. Putin says he and Trump have reached an understanding on Ukraine, warns Europe not to torpedo the nascent progress. I heard that. I heard the threats, you could call them that, to Ukraine and Europe, essentially not to get in the way, not to interfere. There was also, this was imbued entirely, almost from an economic standpoint. You heard a lot of Putin say the opportunities for investment, the opportunities to work together on our economies. That was something that I noted as well. So what we want to do right now, we do want to bring into the conversation more voices. Hal, stay with us. Alongside myself here in the Live Now newsroom, my colleague Austin Westfall as well in the newsroom, Hal Kempfer too, and Timothy Narazzi there with the Washington Examiner. So, Timothy, I'm going to ask you this first. Is there a purposeness in how vague all of this was, do you think? Is there a strategy behind the vagueness of what was just said there?
Well, without knowing what the actual specifics of the agreement or lack of agreement were, we're only speculating, but I don't think it sounds good. If there was major breakthroughs happening, if there were agreements being struck, and if there was a clear path to peace right now, I think that would be something that they'd make a little bit more apparent. And I think they'd be a little more open to, say, questions after the press conference, things like that. There was a bit of a strange disconnect between Putin's rhetoric, which seemed more positive than Trump's. While Trump did pay some lip service to the idea that it was a very productive meeting and things like that, it was Putin that seemed to sort of gesture towards a agreement underway or a better understanding of how to move forward. Trump, from what I know, it said there's no deal until there's a deal, and seemed to downplay that aspect. So I think the vagueness is the message. I don't know that we can expect any sort of major breakthroughs from this.
Okay, so we still are looking live in the vantage point of the venue. Timothy, what did you make? No questions. I mean, that was kind of the main event we were all waiting for. We wanted to see the interplay between Trump and Putin. We wanted them to engage with the press corps, traveling with them. They didn't do it. Why?
I was particularly disappointed because my wife was in that press poll. I was really hoping to get to see her ask a question. But I think on a grander level, it was a little disappointing because we wanted to see that something was moving, that something was being accomplished, and that there was a greater sense of transparency about this. Not in the sense of backroom dealings or anything, but in the sense of what actually was accomplished. Has any ground been broken, or is this simply just another meeting that Putin shows up to, makes some nice remarks, then immediately walks them back the second he's out of the meeting? We haven't really seen anything from that press conference that gives any sort of indication that there's going to be a meaningful change in the dynamic.
Yeah, we're just watching some of this from earlier as the world leaders there gathered on the tarmac in Anchorage. What did you make of kind of the pomp and the circumstance, the symbolism of that, Timothy?
I think it was a gesture of seriousness on America's part, and the literal red carpet, which can be pretty standard procedure, but the red carpet and the flyover and the media opportunities, it was clearly a gesture of seriousness about approaching the discussion with sincere hopes for coming to some sort of ceasefire agreement, something to show that there is a path forward to ending the bloodshed. And it seems as though those might not have worked. They might not have been enough to get Putin to take the negotiations as seriously as Trump had hoped. We have yet to see what Trump's attitude is going to be like in 24 hours. He himself has previously said that he goes to a meeting with Putin. He thinks that everything is going great. He thinks that they've reached some sort of understanding, and then he turns on the TV and a hospital has been bombed. So we're going to see what Russia does in the next 24 hours on the battlefield and how Trump responds to that.
Timothy, what did you make of this moment here? Traveling together in the Beast. You could make the argument that this was the only time today that they were alone.
Yeah, to be a fly on the wall in that car, I mean, who knows what sort of discussions happened in there. But I'm immediately reminded of Putin's visit to North Korea, where he drove the car with Kim Jong-un, and he seems to be quite photogenic when it comes to getting into cars with fellow foreign leaders. It was an interesting photo opportunity, and I think it displayed some sense of, I don't know, gesture towards friendship. And that's something that Putin alluded to during his press conference. But, did Trump find out in the back of that car that Putin wasn't serious? Did he get the inkling? As Secretary of State Marco Rubio previously said ahead of the summit, the United States went into this expecting to understand if Putin was serious not long into the proceedings. So, who's to say if in the back of that car, Trump didn't realize that he was already dealing with someone that was not willing to negotiate in good faith?
Timothy, Austin Westfall here. Trump said during the press conference that he's going to call up NATO. He's going to call up the people who are appropriate. What questions do you have about what Trump says to NATO next and what those conversations are going to entail?
Well, the main question is, what were those tenets that they couldn't agree on? Trump alluded to big things that they couldn't quite get an agreement on. And Putin alluded to the, quote, root causes of the conflict. Root causes traditionally has been Putin's sleight of hand for the non-negotiable objectives of the Russian state. You know, changes of government in Ukraine, massive amounts of territory eaten up by Russia, a lack of security infrastructure for Ukraine, whether that's in NATO or otherwise. These quote, root causes are the very fundamental reason that they are at the war. And they're things that Ukraine is not willing to negotiate on. So if those root causes are the big disagreements that Trump alluded to, I doubt that NATO or Ukraine or anyone is going to want to sign on to that. But again, the details of this have yet to be seen, so who knows exactly.
So, Hal, you had mentioned before the press conference that you anticipated that Trump would lead it off. That's something that he just naturally does. That wasn't what we saw, though, Hal.
It was absolutely not what we saw, and I think that's because, frankly, there was some progress. It's very vague as to what it is, but I think the reason that they let Putin kick it off was because, in Putin's language, was kind of flowery, if you will. It was just kind of a recounting of long relationship and rebuilding relationship and stuff like that. But there were some things to take out of that. And I think the things and this was kind of a concern, was that Putin would do misdirection. And when I started hearing the stuff about, economic things and stuff like that, that's a classic Putin play, if you will, which is to talk about all these other economic things and avoid the core issue. And the core issue, for the whole reason for this summit, is the war in Ukraine. It's not about U.S. trade. It's not about trade opportunities with Russia. It's nothing like that. It's about Ukraine. And I kind of feel that, at least in that press conference, that Putin got a chance to kind of do a little misdirection, if you will. I'm just kind of curious what actually happened in the meeting itself. But the fact that I didn't hear any major substantive achievement specifically, mentioned in either of the remarks tells me that maybe this feel-out thing was just that. It was a feel-out thing. I'm not even quite sure if they're going to have another meeting after this, a trilateral thing with Zelensky. It was kind of some inference that might happen, but then he's saying he's got to call President Zelensky, and which is the right thing to do. But it just didn't have that feeling of momentum that I would have expected if the meeting went really well. Yeah. A lot of equivocation going on.
It was very muted, quite unusual and unorthodox for President Trump, at least. Unusual in the fact that Putin did go first with speaking in his remarks. I want to put this up, and at the very tail end, there was some kind of tongue-in-cheek humor about a potential Trump visit to Moscow. Philip Wegman there at Real Clear Politics. Trump telling Putin at the end of the Anchorage summit, "We will probably see you again very soon." Putin interjects, "Maybe next time in Moscow." Trump calls that an interesting one, adding, "You get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening." So I think at the bottom of the hour, we're going to replay this all for our viewers, because I just have to make note. We were anticipating 60 to 90 minutes for this press conference, and it ended up being about 12 minutes. And that just goes to show you, like I said, the vagueness that was going on, the words, agreement, mutual understanding, substantive. Yes, those are good in diplomacy. But Timothy, to your point also, what did you make of Putin opining on his previous interactions with Joe Biden? He took a dig at Biden, didn't he?
I think that's standard Putin behavior. Takes a jab at Trump's noted enemy. I use it as an opportunity to talk Trump up. He mentioned how if Trump was in office, the war wouldn't have happened, and how he agrees with that, how he can confirm that that is true. Who knows whether that's true or not? That's clearly Putin trying to cater to Trump's ego, and that worked the first couple of times. I'm not sure that this time Trump is going to be charmed again. Again, this is the umpteenth time that they've spoken. Yes, the first time face to face. And Trump came into this rather jaded in the press, talking about how disappointed he was with Putin, how Putin is tapping him along, how this is going to be Putin's final chance before some sort of serious sanction or other penalty. I don't think Trump's buying it. I don't think Trump is going to be charmed just by Putin taking a pot shot at his enemy.
So I got to ask you guys, Hal, when we were previewing this event for the past week, we talked about how big of a deal this event was going to be. Now the event's over. Is that it? Do they pack up? Do they go home now? Does Putin go back to Russia? Does Trump go back to D.C.? Is there nothing else going on?
Austin, that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. It's just over. It wasn't much. You know, they met. I actually think there was more learned about watching them getting to the same car to drive into to the venue than there was from the press conference. I just didn't really get much out of it. It was all platitudes, and it's great to do this. A slight little dig at Biden. Just classic Putin, though. I mean, he's a human intelligence guy, and so he was trying to stroke President Trump's ego by taking a shot at his, political opponent from the last campaign, his predecessor in office, and sure, okay, that's what Putin does, but I just didn't hear much coming out of it, and I kind of feel the same way, which is that it? Is that all that's going to come out of this? What's going to be interesting is to see the headlines tomorrow, so to speak. I know it's kind of a dated term, but it'll be curious to see once this thing has kind of settled into the body politic, and enough people have weighed in on this to see what people are saying about this tomorrow. But I don't think anybody's going to be calling this a wildly successful summit. I just don't see that happening. In fact, I'm kind of curious if other than the White House, I'm kind of curious who's going to call it a successful summit, because it just didn't really achieve, at least from what we know now, or at least what we know, unless something else comes out, it just didn't seem to really achieve much substantive, anything of substance that came out of it. I'm a little, I don't know, I'm a little disappointed with how this came out.
I think that's the overall prevailing sentiment after I think everyone is over the shock of no questions at the press conference that was touted over the last 48 hours. Anticlimactic, I think, is the term a lot of people are using. And we had gone into this, remember, Timothy, Hal, and Austin, that expectations were low. And it seemed like that expectation setting was on purpose for a point, because now we know how this has all gone here. I just have to ask, though, Hal, Timothy, to you guys, one of the main points of meeting in the first place was to get another meeting, possibly between Putin and Zelensky. That achievable was not met. Timothy?
I mean, Putin made the suggestion, as you pointed out at the end, seemingly tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, that the next meeting can be in Moscow. I think that when I heard that, my immediate thought was, well, Zelensky wouldn't be there. So I read that as a sort of dig at the possibility of future meetings, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but Putin doesn't say things for no reason. He always has some sort of message, whether it's explicit or implicit. And the hope was that after this meeting, Trump came into this meeting saying it, the hope was that after this meeting, there would be a very quick turnaround and then a meeting with both Putin and Zelensky with Trump. And Putin suggesting the next meeting is in Moscow, to me, sounds like Zelensky will not be included in that meeting if it were to happen. I'm not sure how Trump is going to respond to that. Again, that was his own desire, was to get Zelensky in the room. That wasn't Zelensky badgering Trump. So if Putin is talking like that, I can't imagine that Trump is feeling very good about the prospect for future meetings.
Timothy, clarify something for the audience. We were watching when we were waiting for Putin and Trump to come out. We saw the pool of press that was there in the room. This is a big undertaking, moving the White House press pool, the world's press, to this one room in order to presumably hold a press conference and ask some questions. You mentioned the idea of your wife being in the room. They are moving all of those reporters there in anticipation of reporters being able to ask questions, correct? That was our understanding.
It was always rather vague, but when you announce a joint press conference and the press is going to be present, I don't think it's that big of a leap in logic to expect that the press will then get to ask a question or two. Now, granted, the language issue exists, Russian and English at the same time, but that's never stopped any sort of joint press conference between world leaders. And again, the expectations for this meeting have ebbed and flowed so much over the last couple of days that no one was really sure what to expect. Everyone hoped for a long press conference with lots of questions from journalists, both American and Russian. I know that there are Russian journalists there, which I don't know why the Kremlin would encourage or allow that sort of thing to happen unless there was some possibility of questions being asked. It's a very big hassle for journalists to get all the way out there, and yeah, it does end up being a massive disappointment, but who's to say why exactly things fell apart?
Mm-hmm. You know, Hal, I wanted to bring up this also. One of the concerns with some of Trump's critics, at least, was that he was going to be taken in by Putin's flattery. Putin was trying. He also mentioned that in agreement with President Trump and candidate Trump, saying all along during the campaign, this war would have never started if he were president at the time. Putin publicly agreed with that sentiment. How did Trump approach him from a body language perspective? Did he keep him at arm's length? Did he embrace him? Was he skeptical? Could you tell? Could you read his face, Trump?
You know, it was interesting. I thought it was actually warmer at the beginning and not as much at the end. And even though President Trump was smiling and nodding, and they were trying to definitely make it look like there was good rapport between the two, I didn't really get a sense looking at the body language. And I don't claim to be the expert on body language, although as you know, in some of the counterterrorism training that I've done, we do address body language. I kind of thought that President Trump looked a little bit stiff, a little bit standoffish, despite making attempts to not look that way. I didn't see the body language at the end as being very close, and the fact that, well, and let's just say, you know, it didn't go to any questions with the press. I can understand why. I don't think they got the progress out of this saying that they really wanted. I don't think they have, you know, the achievement or something that came out of this that they were really hoping for. And frankly, I got to tell you, my sense with the body language is kind of like when President Trump was basically pushing down expectations of this. And when you brought that up, I was like, I don't know if he could have pushed down or you know, expectations as low as what we just saw. I mean, that was this really wasn't much in terms of a meeting. By the way, I just want to say what Timothy remarked on is absolutely correct. That there is no way that President Zelensky is ever going to Moscow to meet. So just that comment there, and Putin does this for a reason. That comment there tells me that you know, there really isn't anything on the table as far as the third meeting going, because I don't think Putin would have made that comment if there was seriously a chance of them meeting someplace like a neutral venue, whether it be in the U.S. or the UAE or Qatar or someplace, or Turkey or someplace. I just don't think he would have said that little sidebar at the end if there was really something that was out there that was real and tangible that had come out of the discussion.
Right. We are at the bottom of the hour, 4:30 here in Phoenix, Arizona, 3:30 there in Anchorage, Alaska, here with Hal Kempfer, Timothy Narazzi there at the Washington Examiner, and my colleague Austin Westfall in the Live Now newsroom. You guys, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Timothy, we'll let you go. Hal's going to be with us for the long haul throughout the course of the evening. When we come back, though, we do want to take the opportunity, in case you may have missed it live, to show you, let you watch again in replay the moments of the statements by President Putin and by President Trump, and then the abrupt close and departure of the two leaders without taking any questions in the room there in Anchorage. So we're going to show you that yet again. We're also garnering and gathering more reaction from around the world, especially Europe, especially Ukraine. So we're looking for that to see how the Ukrainians, the Europeans, our allies, our NATO partners have responded to all of this in just the last 30 minutes. So we still have a lot more on our Anchorage Summit coverage. We'll see you in just 2 minutes. And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. So we still have the live picture there in the room at the moment, and quite a anticlimactic ending to all of this. No questions taken by either Putin nor Trump, ending this very abruptly, making their comments. You're going to watch it in replay in case you might have missed it live. Some live vantage points outside Anchorage as well. That's a zoomed out version there at Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base in Anchorage. Of course, you'll be seeing the departures of Putin and Trump as well here. So let's get to this from just moments ago. This was the main event we were all waiting for, and here's how it went down.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We had very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here, because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well, there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And special envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation. However strange it may sound in these conditions, we have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible. And our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, the border between Russia and the U.S., there is a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that. In political sphere, I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration,